August 20th, 1945. Santo Tomas, Philippines. The tropical heat pressed down like a weight, carried with it the smell of disease, unwashed bodies, and desperation. Lieutenant Robert Hartley, 28 years old, a farmer's son from Minnesota, stood frozen as dozens of skeletal figures in tattered clothing rushed toward him, their voices rising in a chorus that would haunt him for the rest of his life. More. Please, more. Hands grab at his uniform, dozens of hands, thin and trembling, clutching at his sleeves, his shoulders, his arms. Not attacking, begging. These weren't American prisoners he'd come to liberate. These weren't Filipino civilians. These were Japanese women and children, their faces hollow with starvation, their eyes wide with something that looked like terror and hope mixed together in equal measure. They clung to him like drowning people grabbing driftwood. Later, in his diary, Hartley would try to describe that moment. They grabbed my sleeves like drowning people grabbing driftwood, but they weren't drowning in water. They were drowning in years of lies, and I was the first piece of truth they'd touched. What Hartley didn't know yet, what would take days to understand, was that these women had been imprisoned not by America, but by their own government, and they'd been taught to fear him more than death itself. To understand how Japanese women ended up in a Japanese prison camp, begging American soldiers for food, you have to go back to December 1941. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, thousands of Japanese nationals were living throughout Allied territories, the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia. Overnight, they became enemy aliens. Many were interned by Allied forces, standard wartime procedure. But here's what history books rarely mention. The Japanese military also began interning their own civilians, not soldiers who'd failed, not spies who'd been compromised, but ordinary Japanese citizens whose only crime was being, in the eyes of the imperial government, contaminated by Western influence. Japanese women who'd married Western men, mixed-race children born from those unions, merchants who traded extensively with Americans, Christians who converted and adopted Western religious practices, families who spoke English at home, people who owned American books, listened to American music, dressed in Western clothing. In February 1942, the Captivity, Japan's feared military police, established Santo Tomas internment camp outside Manila. While Allied nations used it to house Japanese POWs and civilians, a lesser-known section housed approximately 2,300 Japanese civilians deemed guilty of ideological impurity and cultural treason. Among them was Yuki Tanaka, 35, a Japanese woman who'd married an American businessman in 1935. 3 years into her imprisonment, she'd watched her rations shrink, her health collapse, her hope fade. Her husband was somewhere in an Allied POW camp. She had no idea if he was alive. Michiko Watanabe, 42, had converted to Christianity in 1938. Her mixed-race children had been separated from her and placed in a different section of the camp. She hadn't seen them in 3 years. The irony was cruel. These Japanese women were imprisoned by Japan for being too Western, and they'd been subjected to relentless propaganda that the Americans, if they ever came, would torture them, rape them, murder them. Every day, guards reminded them, the American demons will show you no mercy. They are animals. If they liberate this camp, they will defile you and slaughter you. By August 1945, after 3 years of starvation rations, disease, and psychological torture, many of the women almost believed death would be preferable to American liberation. Then the war ended, and Lieutenant Robert Hartley's unit arrived at their gate. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio broadcasts across the Pacific. Japan had surrendered. 3 days later, on August 18th, Lieutenant Hartley's unit received orders to liberate Santo Tomas internment camp. They expected to find American and Filipino prisoners. Standard liberation procedures they performed at a dozen camps already. When they arrived, they found something that made no sense. The camp was still guarded by Japanese soldiers. But instead of fighting or fleeing, the guards simply bowed, laid down their weapons, and pointed toward the barracks. No resistance, no last stand, just an eerie, defeated silence. Hartley's men swept through the camp, weapons ready, expecting ambush. Instead, they found barracks filled with Japanese women and children in conditions that shocked even hardened combat veterans. Skeletal figures that barely looked human. Children with swollen bellies characteristic of severe malnutrition. Disease was so rampant the smell was overwhelming. Bodies so emaciated that some women couldn't stand without assistance. "Sir," one of Hartley's sergeants called out, confused. "These aren't Americans. They're Japanese. Why would the Japanese imprison their own people like this?" Lieutenant James Nakamura, a Japanese-American translator from the famous 442nd Regiment, began interviewing the survivors. What emerged was a story none of the American soldiers had anticipated. These women hadn't been captured by Japan. They'd been condemned by it. Yuki Tanaka, weak but still able to speak, explained through tears, "We were Japanese, but not Japanese enough. We married foreigners. We adopted foreign ways. We became impure. So they locked us away." The medical officer who examined the first group of survivors pulled Hartley aside with a grim report. "Lieutenant, the malnutrition levels here exceed what we saw in survivors of the Bataan Death March. These people have been systematically starved for years." But an even bigger problem emerged quickly. The women were terrified of their liberators. When American soldiers approached with medical supplies, the women shrank back against walls. Mothers shielded their children. Some began crying, begging in Japanese for mercy. The propaganda had worked perfectly. After 3 years of being told daily that Americans were demons who would torture and kill them, these women faced their liberators with absolute terror. Hartley wrote in his diary that night, "They're more afraid of us than they were of their own guards. We have food, medicine, safety, everything they need to survive. But they won't let us near them. How do you save people who've been taught to fear their own salvation?" By August 19th, 3 more women had died overnight. Time was running out, and standard military procedure, process prisoners, provide basic rations, move to the next camp, wasn't going to work. Hartley faced an impossible choice: follow protocol and let people die, or violate every safety regulation and try something desperate. He chose desperately. August 20th, 1945, 0600 hours. Lieutenant Robert Hartley stood outside the women's barracks, holding a tin of Red Cross rations, about to make a decision that could end his military career. 3 women had died overnight from malnutrition-related conditions. Medical supplies sat unused. Food remained untouched. The survivors were literally dying of fear, too terrified to accept help from the Americans they'd been taught to see as monsters. Standard procedure said, document the deaths, continue distribution attempts, file reports up the chain of command. Don't risk American personnel in volatile situations with enemy nationals. But Hartley saw children dying. He saw mothers too weak to stand. And he made a choice. He would personally deliver food, hand to hand, to every woman in that barracks. Alone, unarmed, until the wall of fear broke down. At 0730 hours, Hartley entered the barracks. His men protested. Never enter a hostile population alone. Even unarmed women and children. The regulations were clear, but Hartley ordered them to stay outside. Inside, the women pressed themselves against the far wall. Some pulled children behind them, eyes wide, bodies trembling, expecting violence. Hartley sat down on the floor, crossed his legs, opened the ration tin, and began eating, not offering it yet, just eating it himself, slowly, showing it wasn't poisoned, proving he was human, not demon. Lieutenant Nakamura stood nearby, translating softly. "He wants to help you. The food is safe. You don't have to be afraid." Silence. 1 minute. 5 minutes. 10. Yuki Tanaka, positioned between Hartley and the other women, watched this American soldier sit patiently on a dirty floor, eating crackers, waiting. 15 minutes passed. 20. Finally, Michiko Watanabe, the Christian convert who'd been separated from her children for 3 years, took one shaking step forward. Then another. Her hand reached out, trembling so violently she could barely control it. Hartley placed a biscuit in her palm. Michiko ate it, and didn't die, and didn't get sick, and nothing terrible happened. The psychological barrier shattered like glass. One woman stepped forward, then 5, then dozens. They came slowly at first, then faster, then in a rush, hands reaching, voices finding sound after years of imposed silence. More, please, more. The phrase wasn't just about food. It was about proof. More evidence that this wasn't a trick. More reason to believe the propaganda had been lies. More hope that they might actually survive. Women clutched at Hartley's uniform. Some wept. Others laughed hysterically. The sound of minds breaking free from years of psychological imprisonment. Yuki Tanaka collapsed, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of everything she believed shattering at once. Nakamura later wrote in his report, Lieutenant Hartley sat for 3 hours while every woman and child in that barracks received rations from his hands personally. Some he had to feed because they lacked the strength to hold food themselves. Word spread to other barracks. Hundreds of women surged toward the building, desperate for the same proof, the same breaking of fear. Military police moved to restore order, but Hartley waved them back. Let them come, he said. They need to know we're human. The scene became chaotic, reaching hands, crying voices, bodies pressing forward not in anger, but in desperate need for connection, for truth, for salvation from the lies they'd been fed. Medics finally intervened when women began fainting from a physical exertion their starved bodies couldn't handle. Hartley physically carried Yuki Tanaka to the medical tent, her last words before losing consciousness. You are not demons. The lie was ours. The days following that breakthrough were a race against death and disbelief. Between August 21st and August 30th, medical teams treated all 2,300 internees. 47 required immediate hospitalization. 12 died despite every intervention, their bodies too damaged by years of systematic starvation to recover even with proper nutrition and care. But physical rehabilitation was only part of the challenge. The psychological impact ran deeper. Many women refused to believe Japan had actually surrendered. They were convinced it was an elaborate American trick, that they'd be fed, fattened up, and then slaughtered. The propaganda had been that thorough. Lieutenant Nakamura and military chaplains worked daily to rebuild trust, to replace lies with truth. Yuki Tanaka, once she'd recovered enough strength, became an informal liaison, helping other women process their liberation. Then, on August 25th, documents were discovered in the camp commander's abandoned office that made everything even more horrifying. Orders from Tokyo, dated 1942, mandating the internment of ideologically contaminated Japanese civilians, and execution orders dated for September 1945, calling for the elimination of all internees as security risks in the event of Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. The women hadn't just been imprisoned. They'd been scheduled for systematic murder by their own government. They were weeks away from death when Hartley's unit arrived. His decision to personally break through their fear hadn't just helped with food distribution. It had established the trust necessary for medical intervention that saved hundreds of lives. By August 30th, all survivors were medically stabilized. But a new question emerged. What happens to Japanese nationals who've been imprisoned by Japan and liberated by America? Repatriation to Japan seemed impossible. Most couldn't return to a nation that had condemned them as traitors. Emigration was offered instead. Of the approximately 2,300 original internees, about 1,800 survived to emigrate. The majority chose to settle in the United States, Australia, or Canada, the very demon nations they'd been taught to fear. Lieutenant Hartley received a commendation for extraordinary humanitarian action beyond duty requirements. His response was characteristically modest. I just fed hungry people. But what he'd really done was prove that humanity could transcend propaganda, that patience had overcome fear, and that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons at all. The historical significance of Santo Tomas extends far beyond individual survival stories. This forgotten camp represents a chapter World War II rarely discussed: the Japanese government's ideological purges of its own citizens, the extremism that led an empire to imprison children for having foreign fathers. The propaganda was so effective it made starving people fear food from their liberators. Lieutenant Hartley's decision became a case study in military cultural sensitivity training. His method, personal, patient trust building, influenced post-war occupation policies in Japan, informing how American forces approached a population that had been subjected to years of anti-American propaganda. Yuki Tanaka emigrated to California. She spent 40 years speaking about her experience, advocating for historical reconciliation and understanding. She maintained correspondence with Robert Hartley until his death in 1987. At his funeral, she spoke the eulogy. He taught us that enemy is a word, but human is a truth. He sat on a dirty floor and offered food to people who'd been taught he was a monster. He was patient when we were terrified. He was kind when we expected cruelty. He saved us not just with food, but with the simple act of treating us as human beings. Michiko Watanabe's children were found alive in a separate section of the camp. The family reunited and settled in Australia, where they became advocates for mixed heritage rights and reconciliation. A photograph preserved in the U.S. National Archives shows the moment that changed everything. Dozens of Japanese women's hands reaching toward the camera, and Lieutenant Hartley's hands distributing rations. Hands that bridge the gap between propaganda and humanity, fear and trust, war and peace. Today, approximately 800 descendants of Santo Tomas internees live in the United States. Their existence is proof that Robert Hartley's patience and compassion rippled forward through generations. The desperate cry, "I want more," meant more than food. It meant more truth, more humanity, more future. Sometimes the most significant battle isn't fought with weapons, but with the simple act of sitting on a floor and offering food to people who've been taught to fear you. That's the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines, but it's the kind that changes the world one outstretched hand at a time.